All right, so this is video starring Jordan Peterson and Destiny, two really big internet personalities, and they're discussing climate change. And basically, I put it in a nutshell. I like putting things in nutshells. I don't like when people make paragraphs of shit just to sound smart. Jordan Peterson is on one side, saying that climate change and the science to prevent climate change has a high margin of error and it has a projection 100 years from now. And he doesn't think that they should bank on that because it will severely affect people in third world countries and people who rely on not green or not clean energy. And Destiny is on the side saying, well, this is a really bad problem. And if we don't do something about it now, then it will make everything worse in the future. But then Jordan Peterson's like, yeah, but how do you know that when it's such a high margin of error? How can we predict something 100 years from now? Just in terms of like a general science, because you couldn't predict 100 years from now, 100 years ago when it came to economics, so on and so forth. But what I can't stand is some people commenting, well, Jordan Peterson doesn't know anything about climate change. He's not a scientist, so why should he have an opinion at all? All right, first of all, Destiny isn't a fucking expert either, and I don't see people saying anything about Destiny's opinion. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is it doesn't matter if you're an expert or not in something. That's the whole point of this country. So what kind of country do you want to live in where you can't express your opinion because you're not an expert in something? That's ridiculous. All right, anyway, we're going to get into the video and I'll make some comments along the way. I'll speed it up a little bit because
one of the things I've
just
seen,
for
you
time.
tell me what you think about this, something that I've seen that actually shocks me, that I was interested in watching over the last 5 or 6 years. I wondered what would happen when the left, the progressives, ran into a conundrum. And the conundrum is quite straightforward. If you pursue carbon pricing and you make energy more expensive, then you hurt the poor. And I don't think you just hurt them. In fact, I know you just don't hurt them. I heard a man 2 days ago who's fed 350 million people in the course of his life, heading the UN's largest relief agency, make the claim quite straightforwardly that misappropriation on the part of interventionist governments increased the rate of absolute privation dramatically in the world over the last 4 or 5 years. And
that's a potential really big deal. Regardless of which political side you come from or if you're an expert or not, that's a really big claim. That's something you should look into. Regardless of your agenda, whether if you believe in that we should be doing everything we can because of the 100-year projection or not, you should really take that in consideration.
And that has happened not least because of carbon pricing, not just carbon pricing, but the insistence that carbon per se is an externality that we should control. Now, Germany's paid a radical price for that, for example, so their power is now about 5 times as expensive as it could be. And they pollute more per unit of power than they did 10 years ago before they introduced these policies that were hypothetically there to account for externality. And the externality was carbon dioxide. I don't think that's a computable externality. And I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that it's actually an externality that we should be warping the economic system to ameliorate, if the cost of that, and it will be an increase in absolute privation among the world's poor. So, and here's an additional argument on that front with regards to externalities. You get that wrong, and here's something you could get right instead. If you ameliorate absolute poverty among the world's 1 billion poorest, they take a longer view of the future. And that means they become environmentally aware. And so the fastest route to a sustainable planet could well be the remediation of absolute poverty. And the best route to that is cheap energy. And we're interfering with the development of cheap energy by meddling with the hypothetically detrimental externality of carbon dioxide.
Interesting theory. I don't know how long, let's say the science is 100% true. The only thing about that is like how long it would affect, like if how long that would go into effect. Because if you're using cheap energy for too long, and the theory is that the longer we keep using cheap energy, the more we're gonna fuck ourselves. But at the same time, you see what he's saying. His whole position is trying to save people who basically afford living well from cheap energy in the short term, and then possibly in the future, you could go into clean energy. But I don't know how long that you could sustain that before switching over to clean energy. And that's the whole problem within itself. We don't know.
And so I think this is a complete bloody travesty, by the way. We are putting the lives of hundreds of millions of people directly at risk right now to hypothetically save people in the future, depending on the accuracy of our projections, 100 years out. And these interventionists, these people who are remediating externalities, they actually believe that they can calculate an economic projection 1 century out. That's utterly delusional.
So, okay, so just to be clear, the first thing, I was just giving an example of how you can use like a government intervention to make a free market track something, which is what cap and trade or like carbon taxes would do. I wasn't necessarily speaking to the strength of that individual thing, but
but that's a good thing to focus on.
Yeah, we can focus on that as well.
Externality.
We can focus on that as well. So, the first thing, this is going to sound mean, but I'm very realistic. There needs to be a better argument than just it disproportionately impacts the poor. That's not always.
Why?
Classic leftist argument.
It might be, but
it's the same argument you made to justify your swing to the left at the beginning of our discussion. You said that you were looking at economic inequalities that disproportionately affected the poor. So I can't see why, and I'm not trying to be mean about this either. I can't see why you could base your argument that it was morally appropriate for you to swing to the left from your previous position because you saw disproportionate effects on the poor, and I can't use that argument in the situation that I'm presenting it right now.
Bang! That's a good argument because Destiny's going to have to come up with something to combat that, but that's a good point. Why does one thing have to change the other?
Well, because it
see what he says.
Depends on if we think it's a condition that ought to be remedied or not. For instance, if I walk around and I see homeless people and I'm like, man, this is really sad. We ought to spend more money on homeless people because it seems like they're disproportionately affected by their living conditions. And then somebody says, oh, well, do you think we should still lock up, rapists and murderers? Aren't they disproportionately poor? I'd probably say, well, yeah, we probably should. And I go, well, isn't that hypocritical? Well, no, I think that rapists and murderers should probably be in jail, but we can also help the homeless at the same time. I think that just helping the poor isn't an argument, like a blank check to do every possible thing to satisfy poorer people.
Right,
it's going to depend on from issue to issue.
That's fine.
So, like, for instance, I think
because the poor, everyone who's poor is not a victim. Some people who are poor are psychopathic perpetrators.
Sure.
And it's very useful to distinguish them. But I was making a much more specific argument. My argument was that the fastest way out of absolute privation for the world's bottom billion people is through cheap energy.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. So I just work my way towards that.
Yeah,
I just want to say that just because something
Destiny wants to starve the rapists. I'm just kidding. I'm putting words in his mouth.
targets the poor is not necessarily an argument against it.
Depends on how hard it targets them, and it depends on whether mass starvation is the outcome.
The outcome is important. That I agree with. So, for instance, like a sin tax.
The outcome will be mass starvation.
I'm getting to it. Okay. Yeah, I'm getting to it. Okay. Sin taxes on like cigarettes and alcohol are always going to disproportionately impact the poor, or even sugar, we might say, right? But just because that disproportionately impacts the poor, is that a good thing or a bad thing? These are probably the people that suffer the most from those particular afflictions. Right.
So, and that is an immediate versus delayed issue too, right? Because the reason,
I mean, obesity is an immediate.
No,
I don't think
alcoholism the reason for the tax is to stop people from pursuing a certain form of short-term gratification at the cost of their longer-term well-being.
Correct. And that exact same idea, if you believe climate models, or if you believe that we're heading in a certain direction in terms of climate, the overall warming of the planet, would be the same argument you would make for climate change.
Only if you believe that you could model economic development 100 years into the future.
Well, we're not trying to model. We're more concerned with modeling climate development, economic development.
We're
yes,
equally. Okay. Tell me how I'm wrong. I don't believe that, because what I see happening is two things. We have climate models that.
Basically, I feel
to get started in data analytics, you don't need previous experience or a degree. The Google Data Analytics Certificate.
There'd be no moral impetus in that. It's the climate's going to change, and that's going to be disastrous for the biosphere and for humanity. But that's an economic argument as well as a climate-based argument.
It's both, but the worst projections of what would happen if the climate took a disastrous turn are worse than the worst projections of what is our planet going to look like economically if we hardcore police, fossil.
Why would you? Okay, but I don't understand the distinction between the models.
Well, the argument would be that whatever pain and suffering poor people might endure right now because of a move towards green energy, that pain and suffering is going to be short-term and far less than the long-term pain and suffering.
Right, but that's dependent on the.
Okay, I get that. Now we're going into the meat of it. You are sacrificing less now to potentially make to prevent a huge catastrophe from happening that would be worse than this one. But that's based on the science of things. This just sounds like Thanos, right? Like the world's resources and cutting the world in half to prevent the resources. It's not the same exact thing, but it reminds me of that. It's sort of like a similar end goal where it's like you're making a sacrifice now to prevent the future. I'm a person that believes you shouldn't sacrifice one person in order for a hypothetical future, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. That's what makes this so complex. Coming from a neutral standpoint, you might be able to try and do something that will benefit people right now and then make a move towards cleaner energy. Perhaps right now we're making too many attempts to make clean energy happen while negatively affecting people who benefit from it too fast. Maybe you could slow that down, but at the same time, how much are you sacrificing? It's not an easy issue. It's not just like one of the issues that you can just say, "Oh yes, do everything you can because in the future it's going to be something really, really bad." But it is a new science, so I understand the skepticism, and at the same time, I kind of do understand believing in the science now because we are more oriented towards science. But at the same time, I would think morality has to come before projections. So it's not an easy subject. But if it were up to me, you have to put the mindset of being morally correct or morally sound, and then maybe you could look at the science, or you could discuss things with people who are either looking into it in terms of like margin of error. Maybe you could give it some time that maybe the margin of error could be smaller through further research, but then you don't know if the further research is research that's going to be sound, if it's only going to be based on an idea or based on pure observation. That's what's hard about science in itself. To rely on something that is a theory in putting in front of morality is something really difficult.